What if the Night King killed everyone? This is an alternate ending to the world of Game of Thrones, where the Night King wins. We'll explore what Westeros becomes when death is not just victorious, but eternal. Snow fell in silence, blanketing the fields of Winterfell in a thick coat of white, untouched by blood now because there was no one left to bleed. The banners that once flapped in the icy wind hung motionless, frozen stiff. The great castle stood still, hollowed and blackened by dragon fire, long since gone cold. No wolves howled, no men stood guard. Just frost-covered stone and the creaking of ice. He walked slowly, not because he was tired, he didn't know fatigue, but because the world no longer demanded haste. The Night King stood where Bran Stark once sat beneath the weirwood tree, the red leaves now shriveled and black. The roots had died weeks ago. The magic that once pulsed through the ancient godswood had drained like blood from a slit throat. No one had expected it to happen this way. They had all believed in prophecy, in fire defeating ice, in chosen ones and final stands. Jon Snow had led the charge, Daenerys atop Drogon lighting the sky in wild orange arcs of flame. Arya had moved like shadow, fast, silent, deadly. But it hadn't mattered. The fire hadn't burned hot enough. The blades hadn't pierced deep. Enough! And the Night King, he had seen it all coming. He was never just a weapon. He was patient. He was calculating. He learned. When Arya leapt from the darkness, dagger in hand, he didn't even flinch. He caught her in mid-air with one hand, her eyes wide in disbelief, and crushed her throat with the other. The sound of her neck snapping echoed louder than any battle cry that night. The last flicker of hope died with her. Jon Snow fell hours later, surrounded by wights in the godswood. Not heroic, not poetic. His sword shattered against the Night King's chest as if Longclaw were just another stick of iron. Drogon screamed as Viserion, reborn in blue flame, tore into his wing and dragged him down into the snow. The dragon burned for hours. The smell of scorched flesh and melted scale never left the trees. And Bran, oh Bran, he had seen everything, yet did nothing. The three-eyed raven watched the end unfold from his wheelchair, eyes glazed, detached from it all. Some said he was waiting for the perfect moment. Others believed he wanted it to happen. In the end, he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared as the Night King reached out a single hand and froze him where he sat, turning him into a monument of failure, encased in glimmering blue ice. King's Landing fell 3 days later. The dead did not tire. They did not sleep. They marched through the neck, breaking every last man who stood before them. Cersei's wildfire traps lit the sky but could not stop the tide. The Red Keep crumbled beneath the weight of the undead. Even Jaime, who had ridden north in one final act of redemption, was crushed beneath the rubble with Brienne at his side. There were no heroes left. The Night King had no need for a throne. He stood in the ruins of the Great Hall, where kings once argued and knelt, and simply turned the floor to frost. The Iron Throne cracked and fell apart, each blade clattering to the ground like the bones of the world's last illusions. Now, Westeros lay frozen. The rivers were still, the seas covered in sheets of unbroken ice. The sun rose rarely, and when it did, it was pale and weak. Entire cities were graveyards. Entire forests stood petrified in frost. There was no rebellion, no hope, only silence. But deep beneath the ruins, in crypts untouched by flame or frost, something stirred. The world may have ended, but stories do not die so easily. Somewhere beneath the shattered ruins of Winterfell, a faint sound echoed, soft, almost like a sigh through stone. The crypts, long believed to be sacred, had become a mass grave not just for Starks, but for those who had run from the war above. They thought they'd found shelter under the castle. They thought stone walls and ancient bones would protect them, but nothing stopped the dead. Among the corpses, One stirred. His name had once been Samwell Tarly. He wasn't alive. Not exactly. His skin was pallid and cold, his lips purple, eyes glazed over with a sheen of white-blue frost. But he moved. Slow, at first. His fingers twitched. His mouth tried to form words he no longer remembered how to speak. Something remained inside, an ember that refused to die. Maybe it was the books he once read. Maybe it was Gilly's name echoing somewhere in the dead chambers of his brain. Or maybe the Night King had made a mistake. Sam was not like the others. When the whites swarmed the crypts and began pulling down women and children, Sam had died, protecting Gilly and little Sam. His last breath had been defiance. The Night King raised him, but something inside him resisted the full pull of death. Now he crawled through the darkness, half dead, half aware. He saw the remnants of statues, the crumbling faces of past kings and queens of the North, staring, down with shattered eyes. His legs didn't work right. His thoughts came in fragments. But he remembered one thing clearly. Old Town, Citadel, fire. The Night King had spared no place. From Dorne to the Wall, every stronghold had fallen. The Citadel had burned, its knowledge lost, its maesters turned into blue-eyed monsters. But somewhere hidden, Sam remembered a scroll, a map, a place the Night King could not reach, Valyria. The Valyrian freehold had died in fire centuries ago. But it was also the only land the dead feared, a place steeped in wild, chaotic magic. The Night King had never crossed the smoking sea. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe something in that cursed land still held power. And if any trace of fire magic remained in the world, it would be there. Sam's broken body kept moving, dragged by purpose, not muscle. Above ground, the Night King stood on the wall again. It had collapsed during the war, torn down by Viserion's flame. But now, massive towers of ice stood in its place, stronger, thicker, enchanted, a monument to his rule. The world behind the wall was no longer the domain of wildlings or rangers. It was now a frozen kingdom of the dead. He did not speak. He never had, but his thoughts were clear, connected to every white walker, every creature he'd turned. They were his eyes, his ears, his claws. Humanity had once mocked the dead for being mindless. But the Night King was no brute. He was building something. Far in the east, the lands of Essos trembled. The dead had crossed the narrow sea on rafts made from frozen corpses. Cities fell one by one. Slaver's Bay turned to black ice. The Red Temple of Volantis was overrun. Its fire priests turned into blue-eyed husks, yet not all fire had gone out. In the ruins of Dragonstone, a girl wandered. She was small, no older than 10, wrapped in the burnt remnants of a red cloak with dark hair and ash-covered skin. She had no name, not anymore, but she could see flames, not with her eyes, with her soul. And when she whispered to them, the fire listened. The Night King hadn't found her yet. He would. But not before she saw something in the fire. A face. A fat man crawling through tunnels beneath a castle. And beside that man, deep in the frozen crypts, something else began to stir. A direwolf. Ghost's fur was no longer white. It was gray and stiff with frost, matted with soot from the fires above, and the blood of too many battles. He had survived the fall of Winterfell, though no one should have. When the whites poured through the gates and the flames died in Drogon's throat, Ghost had vanished into the shadows, bleeding, snarling, half-starved. Jon was gone. He had seen him fall, torn from his horse and dragged into the snow. But Ghost hadn't stopped moving. He had hidden in the crypts for weeks, feeding off dead flesh when he had to, tearing through bones when the hunger grew too loud. He was no longer just a direwolf. Death had marked him, clawed at his soul, and Something inside him had changed. Yet like Sam, he hadn't turned. His eyes still glowed red, not blue. The fire still lived in him, small, stubborn. When he found Sam, barely crawling across broken stone, Ghost did not attack. He growled once, low and confused, but then lowered his head beside him. Recognition flickered in what was left of Sam's clouded mind. "Ghost," Sam croaked, though his throat made more sound than sense. You're still here." Ghost licked the side of his frozen hand. They moved together, slowly, climbing toward the surface. Sam's legs didn't work anymore. He pulled himself with his arms, his breath short, wheezing, but Ghost nudged him along, biting his cloak when he started to falter. The crypt stairs were cracked, frozen solid. Above them, the castle was a mausoleum of ice. The wind outside howled like a beast. Towers lay half-collapsed. Banners turned to brittle rags. Whites still wandered the courtyards, patrolling silently, their purpose long since merged with the will of the Night King. But Ghost knew how to move between them. Sam, barely breathing, clung to the direwolf's back as they weaved through shadows. They didn't head north, not yet. Sam wasn't ready. He needed fire. He needed to remember. So they went south, to the broken library of Winterfell. The wooden door was gone, ripped from its hinges. Inside, the shelves were mostly burned, the books half frozen or charred. But in one corner, buried beneath ice and rubble, a satchel still lay intact. Sam reached it with numb fingers and pulled out what remained of his old notes, scribbled parchment, maps, translations. A single piece of dragon glass still nestled at the bottom. Ghost growled suddenly. Outside, the sky changed. The clouds turned blue. Not the soft blue of morning, but the deep, sickly hue that always came before the dead marched. The Night King was moving again, not just watching. He was angry. Something in the weave of death had shifted. A thread had pulled loose. In Dragonstone, the little girl awoke with a gasp. Her eyes burned orange for a second before returning to brown. She had no name, but Melisandre had called her Ember before the flames took her. The Red Woman had died screaming during the fall of the North, but before she passed, she'd whispered into Ember's ear, "You are the last flame. Keep burning." Ember stumbled out of the ruins barefoot, fingers black with soot, eyes blinking against the wind. She didn't know where to go, but the fire always whispered. It showed her visions, a castle of ice, a beast of shadow, a man, without warmth, who still dared to move. She saw Ghost. She saw Sam. She began walking north. In the deep north, the Night King stood unmoving on the wall's peak, watching. His hand rose slowly, and thousands of miles away, hundreds of whites turned, as one, toward Winterfell, toward Sam. The game wasn't over. One piece had survived the board. The whites didn't run. They never did. But when they moved, it was like a tide, endless, unstoppable, silent. They didn't breathe. They didn't scream. They just marched. Sam watched them from the crumbled tower of Winterfell's library, huddled beneath shattered stone with Ghost beside him. His fingers trembled, not from fear. He couldn't feel fear anymore, not the way he used to. His heart barely beat, but his mind, it was alive. More alive now than it had been in weeks. Maybe it was the dragon glass, maybe it was Ember's vision reaching him somehow. Or maybe it was just that old, desperate need to survive. He unfolded one of the pages from the satchel, a crude map, scribbled notes in his own handwriting, mostly from stolen scrolls and forgotten legends. One word was circled in red ink so many times it had bled through the paper. Valyria. If there was a place where death still feared the living, it was there. But Sam knew he couldn't make it alone. Not across an entire continent. Not without a dragon. Not with half his body dead and the other half hanging on by stubborn memory. But someone else could. Someone's still burning. "Ghost!" he whispered hoarsely, touching the direwolf's neck. "You have to find her!" Ghost looked at him with eyes too knowing for any beast. He nudged Sam's chest once, then backed away. Sam reached into the satchel and pulled out a piece of torn parchment. On it, he drew what he could: symbols, lines, the rough shape of Westeros. Then, with shaking fingers, he dipped the end of the dragon glass into old blood pooled beneath the stones and traced a circle over Dragonstone. Fire lives here. He tied the paper to a strand of Ghost's old torn collar, tightened it, then leaned in close. Find the fire. Find her. Ghost didn't hesitate. He turned, silent and swift, and disappeared into the cold. The moment he vanished into the snow, Sam sank against the stone, weaker than ever. The frost crept up his legs again like vines whispering of surrender, but he held on. Even in death, Samwell Tarly refused to stop believing in stories. Miles away, Ember stumbled across the corpse-strewn beaches of Blackwater Bay. Her small hands glowed faintly as she stepped over twisted bodies frozen mid-scream. She felt every one of them, heard their final moments as a pulse in the back of her head. She didn't understand it, but the fire inside her responded. Sometimes when the wind died down, she could still hear Melisandre's voice. There is no true death, only silence or song. The girl chose song. She whispered softly as she walked, words in the old tongue, words she didn't fully know. And when she did, small embers floated from her mouth and hovered in the air like fireflies. The corpses twitched, but didn't rise. They were bound by something older than the Night King. Old magic, broken but buried deep beneath dragonstones, bedrock. A howl pierced the cold wind. Ghost emerged from the fog like a spirit, covered in ice, his breath steaming faintly. His red eyes locked on hers. Ember stepped back, startled, but then her fire flared. Just once, and Ghost stopped. He lowered his head and approached slowly, like he understood her in a way no one else ever had. She knelt and touched his fur. For the first time in days, she felt warmth. Then she saw the parchment tied to his collar. She didn't understand the symbols, but she saw the circle. She saw the blood, and she saw the crude image of a wolf, just like him, pointing north. Something deep in her chest ached. She had to go. In the heart of the frozen sea near the ruins of Valyria, something stirred. Beneath blackened waves where no man dared to sail, a presence older than time opened its eyes. It was not of ice. It was not of fire. It was both and neither. And it had waited centuries for the Night King's mistake. The wind screamed over the snow-covered plains of the north, hollow and cold like the world's last breath had been stolen and never returned. Sam didn't move. He couldn't. His body was failing. Too long without food. Too long with frost in his blood. But his mind, it still ticked like a broken clock, refusing to stop. In his lap rested the last page he had copied from a Valyrian scroll before the citadel fell. A fragment, barely legible. Fire cannot kill death, but death can remember what fire once was. He had read it 1,000 times. It made no sense. But something about it gnawed at him, like it was a riddle that mattered more now than it ever had. Maybe because that thing stirring in Valyria, the one the old legends warned about, was not a savior. It was something worse. He blinked, slowly, his breath shallow. He remembered Jon's eyes as the dead dragged him under, Arya's broken body in the snow, Gilly screaming in the dark. He remembered everything, and he wondered briefly if it had all been for nothing. Then the ground began to shake, just faintly, a distant rumble like thunder beneath the earth, not footsteps, something deeper. Far across the sea, Ember clutched Ghost's fur as he bounded across the ruined vale, climbing through shattered passes and burnt forests. She had seen the fire once more last night, in her dreams. She had seen a man in chains, beneath the ice, his eyes still human. She saw his lips trying to speak. She had heard his name once in the flames, whispered like a secret that refused to die. Jon. She didn't understand why it mattered. She had never met him. But the fire showed her paths for a reason, and now it was leading her to the farthest edge of the world, to the Frostfangs, where the last bits of living memory hid beneath a tomb of ice. Ghost ran without tiring. Every hour they crossed another ruined kingdom. No humans, just ash. Broken bones and the ever-present cold. The dead had spread like disease. Cities lay silent, castles untouched, but lifeless. But the girl kept moving. The fire burned hotter with every step north. Deep beneath the ruined heart of Valyria, a storm brewed. The smoking sea had stopped smoking. Its waters had frozen solid weeks ago, something that had never happened in recorded history. Ships that had been lost decades earlier now sat like preserved relics above the waves. But the dead did not go near, because something had woken. Not a creature, not a god, a memory. Born of magic too wild to be tamed and too old to be killed, it began to rise. It had no face, no body. It wore the shape of fire and shadow both. It had once lived among dragons, spoken to Valyrian kings in dreams. It had watched the doom and stayed buried when men fell to pride. But now the balance was broken. The Night King had tilted the scale too far. Life had become a whisper. Death, a scream. So the thing under Valyria rose, and it began to call. To Ember. To Jon. To something else. In the middle of the frozen sea, a dragon stirred. But it was not Drogon, nor Rhaegal, nor Viserion. This one had no name, no saddle, no rider. It had once been chained beneath Valyria, locked away by fire magic so old the Targaryens dared never speak of it. Not even in the Blackfire rebellions had it been released. Not even when Aegon conquered the Seven Kingdoms. It had waited. And now it broke free. One flap of its wings shattered the frozen waves. Its roar cracked the sky. Its scales were not red, not black, not blue. They were white-hot, like molten silver, glowing with an inner fire that screamed against the ice. The Night King felt it. He turned his gaze west. For the first time in an eternity, he moved faster. In a cave beneath a forgotten glacier, in the far north, Jon Snow opened his eyes. He didn't breathe, but he was not dead, not fully. And in the dark, something deep in his chest began to burn. Jon's eyes were pale gray, not blue like the whites, not warm like the living. He lay beneath a mountain of ice in a shallow cave where cold had seeped into the very stone. His armor was rusted. His body, once broken, had knit itself back, together, but not by natural means. The Night King hadn't killed him outright. He had marked him again, like before, but this time Jon hadn't turned. Not fully. Somewhere between death and life, his soul had become tethered, not to a god, not to a purpose, but to something older, something burning just out of reach. His fingers twitched. He sat up slowly, gritting his teeth against the pain. It wasn't the pain of wounds. It was the pain of remembering. Winterfell falling. Arya's neck crushed. Daenerys screaming as Viserion turned against her. His sword shattering like glass against the Night King's chest. And Bran, silent as ever, letting it all happen. He had failed. And yet, he was still here. His heart didn't beat the same, but it beat. And in the center of his chest, beneath the layers of frost-bitten skin and ancient scars, a strange warmth pulsed, steady, unnatural. He stood, dragging himself toward the cave entrance. Outside was a world he barely recognized. Snow buried the old landmarks. The sun, dim and pale, hung low like it had forgotten how to rise. But he could feel a pull now, a thread dragging at his bones. Someone was coming. Ember's hands burned, not with pain, but with power. Ghost had led her through ravines and ruins, across fields of snow where old battles had turned to quiet graveyards. The whites avoided her. Some turned to face her and simply froze, their blue eyes flickering like dying candles. She didn't understand how or why. All she knew was this: the fire inside her was growing. She stopped on a ridge overlooking a long frozen lake. There on the far side stood a shape moving through the snow. Slow, staggered, but tall, familiar. Ghost barked once. A low, mournful sound. Ember's breath caught. She stepped down the ridge, ignoring the cold biting at her bare legs, her eyes never leaving the figure. The man stopped moving, then turned. And for the first time, Jon Snow saw the last spark of fire left in the world. Across the sea, the Night King stood still on a cracked glacier floating through the shivering sea. His eyes were locked not on the humans, but on the sky. The silver dragon was coming, wings like firestorms, scales that blazed even through clouds. The beast had not been made by Valyrians. It had made the Valyrians. Its scream shattered icebergs. The Night King raised his hand. Thousands of miles away, every single white stopped moving. Every dead man, woman, and child across the Seven Kingdoms turned toward the north, toward Jon, toward Ember, toward the spark they had missed. This was no longer a battle for the throne or for kingdoms. This was death demanding full dominion, and life, what little was left, gathering its last defenders. In the caves below Dragonstone, molten rock began to churn. And from the ashes of old magic, the last children of the forest opened their eyes for the first time in over 1,000 years. The Night King had awakened, something more than war. He had awakened balance. Jon dropped to one knee as Ember reached him. He stared at her. This girl, this stranger with eyes like burning coals and a heart that hadn't given up. "You came for me," he rasped, voice dry and broken. Ember nodded. Then she touched his chest, and the fire leapt from her fingers into his heart. In the next breath, the frost around them began to melt, not in rivers, in explosions. The explosion wasn't fire. It was something older, deeper. Fire as it was before men tamed it. The kind of heat that knew no mercy, no boundary. The kind that reshaped the world. When Ember's fingers touched Jon's chest, the cave around them cracked. The walls hissed and steamed. For a brief moment, Jon screamed. Not in pain, but like something had been torn from him and something else forced in. His veins lit up gold, his eyes flashed white, and then the world blinked. The frozen lake shattered in a single thunderclap, sending sheets of ice flying into the air. Whites patrolling miles away collapsed mid-step, their bones snapping apart as if pulled from within. Across the north, wherever the fire could reach, the dead fell. Jon stood slowly. He was taller, not in body, but in presence. Like something had uncoiled inside him and now stood with him. The fire that Ember had given him didn't consume. It fused. He was no longer just Jon Snow. He was something else now, the balance. Ember fell to her knees, exhausted, eyes rolling back. Ghost stood beside her, silent and watchful, his breath coming fast. Jon lifted the girl gently in his arms. She was small, shivering, not dying, but spent, and the cold was coming again. He turned toward the east, toward the Night King. The time for hiding was over. Across the world, the silver dragon roared over the ruins of Valyria. Beneath its shadow, cities burned, but not from its fire. From their own broken oaths, the dragon was not coming to fight for mankind. It was coming to judge. For centuries, the Valyrians had kept secrets buried in stone and blood, sacrifices, forbidden spells, chains meant for gods. The dragon remembered. It had been their weapon once until it turned on them. Now it was free, and it flew not toward the Night King, but toward Jon. The Night King stood atop a jagged glacier near the shattered wall, his army surrounding him like a crown of bones. His gaze turned south. He had underestimated the fire. The girl, the man who had died and refused to stay dead. He lifted both arms. The sky darkened. Viserion, his dead dragon, shrieked from the clouds, circling above him like a starved beast. The rest of the world began to slow, winds rising, snow turning into knives in the air. This would not be a battle. It would be a reckoning. Jon marched through the blizzard with Ember in his arms, Ghost leading the way. They stopped at the edge of the old wall, where nothing but ice and death stretched before them. The wind howled. Ember opened her eyes and whispered, "He's waiting." Jon nodded. "Good." He set her down gently. "Stay here." She grabbed his wrist with a strength that surprised him. "You can't kill him alone." Jon looked at her, really looked. A child, barely more than skin and bone, carrying power, too great for her frame. "I'm not alone," he said. And for the first time since the fall of Winterfell, he smiled. Because far above them, piercing through the clouds, came the roar of the silver dragon. It landed with such force that the ice beneath cracked for miles. Snow lifted in waves. Ember shielded her eyes. The dragon looked at Jon and did not kneel, but tilted its head. Waiting. Jon walked forward. The heat around it didn't burn him. Its eye, glowing like the heart of a volcano, reflected the man who had returned from death, twice and still chose to fight. He placed one hand on its snout, and the fire accepted him. High above, the Night King raised his frozen spear. Viserion shrieked, but Jon was already climbing the silver dragon's back. The last war was about to begin. Fire had risen from ash, and death was about to find out what fear truly meant. The sky cracked open as fire met ice. One last time. Jon gripped the silver dragon's ridges, his fingers bleeding from the heat that pulsed beneath its scales. It didn't burn him. It tested him. Every second he rode it, it felt like his soul was being pulled in. Two, one half cold, one half flame. He was no Targaryen, not in name, but the fire had chosen him. Below, the Night King stood atop a mountain of frozen dead. Viserion circled above him, screeching, mouth leaking tendrils of blue flame. The sky itself seemed to recoil, clouds twisting, as if unwilling to watch what came next. Jon didn't scream. He didn't raise his sword. He didn't have one anymore. What he carried was older than steel. Inside him, Ember's fire blazed, fused with something even deeper. Magic not born of gods, but of balance. He wasn't fire, he wasn't ice. He was judgment. The silver dragon dove. Viserion met it in the air, and the two beasts collided in a shockwave that shattered glaciers below. Jon held tight as talons clashed, wings tore at each other, and flame met flame. One pure white, the other cursed blue. The air caught fire and frost at once, creating storms that lit up the world for miles. Jon jumped. He landed hard on the Night King's frozen plateau. The creature turned toward him, slow, deliberate, no emotion in those cold, endless eyes. Around them, thousands of whites emerged from the snow like insects. The air was thick with their groans, their hunger. Jon didn't flinch. The Night King stepped forward. The two stared at each other, inches apart. No words, just memory. Jon's eyes narrowed. "You lost." The Night King tilted his head, then drove an ice spear forward. Jon caught it, not with strength, but with flame. His bare hand, still bleeding, lit up in golden fire. The spear hissed, cracked, then shattered in his grip. The Night King's hand twitched, and Jon plunged his burning palm into the creature's chest. But this wasn't like before. No dragon glass, no Valyrian steel, just raw, unfiltered power. The Night King screamed, not aloud, but through the sky itself. His army staggered. The glacier cracked beneath them. The fire was not killing him. It was undoing him, piece by piece, memory by memory, the children of the forest, the first man he once was, the hatred that had grown in him, the loneliness, the silence, the rage. All of it burned, not in destruction, but in revelation. The Night King looked down. For the first time in thousands of years, his eyes flickered. Not blue, but a hint of the man he had once been. A flicker of fear, regret, or maybe release. He collapsed. The whites fell with him. Thousands of corpses turned to dust, vanishing into the snow. Across Westeros, cities that had been silent groaned with the collapse of frozen corpses. The seas began to crack. Rivers flowed again. The war was over. Jon collapsed beside the melting remains of the Night King, gasping. He wasn't dead, but he had nothing left. His hands were scorched. His veins glowed faintly, the fire still inside, but dim now. He had given nearly all of it. Above, the silver dragon circled once, then landed. Ghost howled in the distance, and Ember ran across the ice toward him. She knelt beside Jon, placing her small hand on his chest. He opened one eye and smiled faintly. "You burned brighter than any king," she whispered. Jon exhaled. "You saved me." "No," Ember said. "We saved each other." In the days that followed, the world began to thaw. The wall melted. The sun returned. Across Westeros, silence gave way to songbirds and flowing rivers. No rulers remained. No houses left to fight over thrones. The age of kings was gone. In its place, something new would be born. Not of swords or dragons, but of memory. Of pain. Of stories told in firelight. Jon disappeared after that. Some say he walked into the smoking sea and became part of the flame. Others say he lived among the last children beneath Dragonstone, never speaking again. Ember remained for a while. She rebuilt nothing, but she remembered everything. And when asked what ended the long night, she would only say, "It wasn't a hero. It wasn't a sword. It was a choice. One soul, choosing not to give up, even after death." And the fire would flicker, quietly, as if it agreed.